Almost every community goes through crises at some point in their history, and some go through them quite regularly. Of course, the origins of the crisis might be different. It might be a major crime, a fire, a flood, an epidemic, an economic downturn, or so on. But no matter what the origin, almost always a mix of impacts come into play. The effects might be on people's health, on the economy, social impacts, psychological factors, spiritual effects. And so caring for these communities does require a holistic approach. Often it's the social and spiritual elements of care that are neglected by the wider social structures that may not be as familiar with these pieces. And so looking at what churches have to offer when a crisis or disaster looms is very important.
The Center for Rural Community Leadership and Ministry, otherwise called CircleM, recently hosted an online training webinar on community disaster and trauma management. The insight and encouragement of church leaders, emergency service providers, and other experts will help people in town and country communities rethink and possibly restructure how their church or organization will move forward in planning with their community for times of crisis. Experience has shown us that in our rural areas, emergency measures organizations and faith groups are often not very well connected to each other. In fact, it's often the case that emergency measures organizations don't know about the many things that churches can bring to the table as far as supporting crisis response and recovery. And sometimes even churches themselves haven't thought deeply about the many things that they have to give. So this webinar seeks to bridge that gap. The end goal is to enhance the resilience of the places that we serve together, whether we are emergency service responders or churches or someone who lives in both of these worlds. It is important to note this training is not emergency response training. Instead, it is an exercise in awareness, presented in 9 presentations on crisis preparedness and response. We are hopeful that you will take the time to view the presentations, take what you learn, and using the connections in your community, go out and enhance the specific details of preparedness as it makes sense for where you are. Here are some snapshots of what you will see in the 9 presentations.
There's lots of figures out there that talk about the impact of disasters and how many people are really affected on a daily basis. We know from 2012 alone that 32.4 million people across the globe were displaced. And in that same time period in North America, 1.8 million people were displaced due to a disaster of some sort. If you watch anything about weather, you'll know that we no longer talk about the storm of the century or the storm of the decade, but the storm of the year. There's just so many weather changes and so many issues that we need to be thinking about and talking about. Things are occurring more frequently and they're becoming more destructive each time that they occur.
The unfortunate reality of life is that none of us gets to determine exactly how our day goes. We don't really know what's going to happen when we wake up in the morning. Certainly, there could be disasters that strike our communities. These could be natural gas explosions, or flash floods, or a train derailment, or many, many other kinds of disasters that could impact us, our community, our neighbors, our friends. And so it's up to us to be prepared in those inevitable situations. There are 4 key pillars to emergency preparedness that we need to be aware of. The first one is mitigation. Actually taking a look around your community, seeing where the danger spots are, what possibly could happen. And then the second one is preparation. That once we know what those high risks are, or once we know what the dangers are, how are we going to be prepared in case something happens? The third point is response. Now that we know what's possible to happen and we've hopefully prepared for it, if something in fact does happen, how do we respond to the disaster? The fourth key pillar is recovery. Once we've gone through the response and we've seen the dust settle and things calm down a little bit again, how are we going to help our community to recover? What are the things that we're going to do to help people get back to their normal lives? Those are the 4 key pillars that we're going to look at in emergency planning.
Good evening. The story is shockingly familiar. A massive explosion at a Canadian mine. Workers on the job underground. 9 of them killed. It happened this morning at the giant gold mine near Yellowknife. Immediately, there was the memory of Westray. That's the coal mine in Nova Scotia where an explosion last May killed 26 workers. The investigation of today's explosion has barely begun, but already there's one striking difference: the possibility of sabotage.
We're talking about an experience that happened to us in 1992, and as a result of that and the events that followed, we learned a lot about how a community and how a church respond to man-made disaster. When there's a natural disaster, like fire or flooding, the tendency is for a community to come together. But when the disaster is human-instigated, things can be just the opposite, and the road to recovery can be very unclear.
We, as the Salvation Army and many other community groups in Yellowknife, came together to provide food for the families who were involved in the strike lockout. We also provided services, though, to those on the mine site because they couldn't leave the premises. Because the situation was so antagonistic, we, as the churches, were the only ones allowed to respond to many of these needs, both with those on strike lockout and those who had crossed the picket line. And we were perceived as neutral, and we had some ability to cross over the picket line when no one else could. When we got to the hospital after the explosion happened, we heard that there was no casualties, only fatalities. That night, the bars closed down early because there were so many fights both breaking out in the bars and on the streets. We heard that there was people carrying guns on the streets, that it was a time of deep, incredible anger, and yet it was a time for many of us when we had just a deep, deep sadness that this could happen in our community. To help, we set up a crisis line at the hospital, and we then formed what became known as the Yellowknife Community Support Group.
One of the many things that we learned was that the church community was much better equipped to deal with this kind of an issue than the town as a whole, to deal with many of the social issues that came along when a disaster strikes. Government and health organizations simply weren't equipped to deal with a lot of it, either on a short or on a long-term basis. As you can imagine, the grief of many families was extreme, and there was a lot of work going on with individual families. But there was also a communal grief, and it was decided very early on in the process that we would come together and have a community memorial service. Every community has to have an emergency plan filed with the province or the territory, and churches can contribute to the development of that plan. How? By getting involved, by finding out where and how the church community fits in to that plan.
What happened to us on June 20th happened so quickly and with such a rapid amount of power that unfolded that we really didn't know what was happening from one side of town to the next. People were trapped in vehicles as intense floodwaters literally ravaged most of the southwestern part of town. Downtown businesses were destroyed. Many were having to be rescued by helicopter or by combine or manure spreader or front-end loader or anything that had a vehicular transmission and engine that could be above the waterline. You can expect to deal with something that we often call compassion fatigue, and that was something entirely new for me, where my output level was simply so high and so continuous that I reached a point where I just simply had no more to offer anybody else, including myself. Give yourself the opportunity to lower the bar. Lower your expectations about everything. Don't lower your asking from people, because people will still step up as they're able. But don't expect as much from your staff or from your team, from your church, your congregation, or your volunteers, because they simply don't have all that much to give. Remember to ask, because many of them do, and many of them would still like to try. But when you lower the bar, you will give people a great safety net.
How we respond to people when the trauma happens can be significant in terms of their risks for PTSD. All of the big counselors that deal with PTSD set up tents outside Ground Zero and did emergency critical incident stress debriefing with the people after 9/11. The satisfaction ratings from the people that went for counseling were high. They felt that the counseling really helped. They found that people who had debriefing, even though they feel it might have helped, had higher rates of PTSD and got worse than people who had nothing. So how do us as lay people or field workers help somebody promote resilience? And what are the phases in psychological first aid, which is the approach that many agencies are using now, including the Red Cross and World Health? It's something that can be used by anybody, and it's designed for anybody who's in distress. It doesn't mean that you're going to do all of the counseling, but you can do some immediate measures to help support them and to help promote that resilience, and then link them with other people.
Town and country communities tend to experience deep, recurrent economic stressors, in part because they depend on a fairly narrow economic base that can be deeply affected by a single change in the industry. And so they go through what are sometimes called boom and bust cycles. The sense of loss, economically and emotionally, from these events can certainly be overwhelming individually. But it can also leave whole communities depressed and often in shock with very little energy left for rebuilding. According to a recent human health study of 300,000 people by Brigham Young University, they found that those with poor social supports had a higher risk of premature death than that which came from obesity or smoking. Imagine if we put our money and research into creating social supports the same way we do related to smoking and obesity, we'd have much healthier populations. So, caring friends are important. It's important for them to be present, to listen, certainly to avoid all negative judgments. And this is where churches can have an important role to play. Churches can help individuals within our town and country communities recover from crisis. And they can also support the community as a whole by helping them to regain their sense of self-esteem and their hope for the future again.
So what disaster recovery model actually works for our province, our country, and our rural communities? This graph offers a particular way of looking at disasters and what happens to people. The red line starts from pre-disaster, where there might be some warnings and threats, and it goes to long after the actual impact event. So when I say impact, what am I referring to? Well, I'm referring to all sorts of disasters: floods, fires, tsunamis, other kinds of significant crises that likely cause evacuation and cause some kind of alteration or change for the people. So following this first part of the graph, which shows the pre-disaster, people enter the honeymoon phase. And this is a time when there is this great heroic effort, and it results in a much higher level of cohesion and a much higher level of resilience, because people say things such as, we're doing this together, we're going to get through this, we're going to be a better, stronger community afterwards, we're not going to give up, we're going to rebuild. And then, of course, what happens? The tougher work sets in. Media goes away. People forget about the community that had the disaster or had that impact. And sometimes then people also leave the community, and people get tired, and people shift into a disillusionment phase, and they begin to wonder whether or not all their work and efforts are worthwhile, and whether or not things are ever going to go right again. Perhaps a year afterwards, there is the expected anniversary event. And it is really an event that causes some people to reflect on and to cause some kind of emotional reaction because of what they experienced before. They might be still going through grief. They might be still coming to terms with what happened. And sometimes they're struggling with the various setbacks that have occurred during that time where they made those heroic efforts and tried to get better. But we have to also remember that reconstruction is underway and there is a new rebuilding of that community is going on and a new beginning. So who can help create these resilient communities? Lots of people. Government at all levels, whether that's local, regional, provincial, or national. Private business sectors, non-profit organizations, religious groups, other groups, volunteers. In other words, all of us. All of us have a role to play in creating resilient communities after disaster.
I'm Joyce Sassy, a retired United Church minister, and I've been resident in Pincher Creek for 25 years. From 1995 to 2003, we had numerous tragedies and disasters that happened in and around our community. During this time, volunteers pitched in to do what they could under the guidance of the first responders. And repeatedly, year after year, we had to pick ourselves up and shake ourselves off and take a breather and then carry on as best we could.
Well, we've always been really good at dealing with the hard stuff, say putting out a fire. But we've had a tougher time looking after the soft things, the things taking care of people, for example, things that really matter. So what we're trying to do now is be proactive. We've looked at the needs of the community and decided that emergency social services is something that we have lacked in the past and something that we need. As we move into the future, we're looking at implementing a good social service program along with a good emergency services program. We're looking forward to working with community church groups and also other interested individuals in the community to make this happen, so that we can become more proactive in taking care of the things that really matter, the soft issues, the people issues in the community.
When it came to those disasters of the decade, that's when our ministerial really started to strengthen itself. And now we're a solid unit for each other and for the community. Disasters never announce themselves, but when they happen, we have to be ready to respond. Through events like this webinar, I appreciate joining with those who are intent on helping each other to prepare for the eventual. Our faith groups have much to offer in times of crisis, things that go beyond our church buildings and beyond our soup kitchens. Fostering hope and resilience is important, and out of it comes something more. We can't go back to where we were, but we can move well beyond it.
The work of enhancing your community's emergency response plan will also enhance your community's health and its sense of belonging. Why? Because it brings people together to work together, and it engages a broad constituency. We encourage you to view the various presentations that are part of this church and community crisis response training with members of the wider community. If you'd like some help thinking through who should be involved, you can contact Circle M. Here are some questions that your community might benefit from. Circle M is a nonprofit organization that works to encourage town and country churches to be life-giving agents in their community. We do this by helping build bridges, such as we are doing through this crisis and preparedness training.